There is a soil created by human hands more than 2,000 years ago that remains more fertile today than freshly fertilized farmland. No fairy tale, no exaggeration, no promise from a brightly printed seed packet. Measurable, lab-tested soil that soil scientists from multiple countries still visit today with spades and sample containers because the readings simply won't let them go. The same earth, the same rain, the same season, and yet a world of difference between what thrives on this patch and what vegetates miserably on the neighboring, seemingly identical soil. The secret behind this earth is a dark, lightweight powder. It costs less than $2 a kilogram wholesale. You can make it yourself from the branch and shrub clippings in your own garden, from plant residues that would end up on the compost pile anyway. And a single application, done correctly, and one specific step is crucial here, can be enough to permanently transform your garden soil. Not for one season, not for 5 years, but potentially for generations. If you're thinking this sounds like an exaggeration, let it be said that this skepticism is smart and justified. Good gardeners question what they are promised, but science has stood behind this substance for decades. German and European research institutes have studied, measured, and compared it in the lab and in years of field trials. The results are so clear that they have long since entered the professional discussion at the federal level. What is missing is the connection between what laboratories and field trials know and what hobby gardeners can do with a shovel tomorrow morning. We want to close this gap together today. Today, we will discover three things that often surprise even experienced community gardeners. The first is the history of this substance, because it has a past that is far older than any bag of fertilizer off the shelf, beginning in places that could hardly be further away from German allotment gardens. And yet, this history leads surprisingly close to our own gardening biographies, to the small techniques passed down from grandmothers to mothers and from mothers to daughters, without anyone ever using a technical term for it. The second is the biology, because what goes on inside a single crumb of this black powder initially sounds like fantasy, but is seamlessly proven by electron microscopy and decades of field trials. And the third is the practical side, how you can make this substance yourself, how to prepare it correctly, and what mistake causes almost everyone to think the whole thing is ineffective on their first try. This mistake is amazingly easy to avoid once you know what's behind it. Pay special attention to the section on the raised bed and the container variant, because for anyone who can no longer bend down for long or simply doesn't want to, there is an approach that requires only a simple hand trowel and works specifically per plant, without heavy bags, without deep digging, without back-breaking work. And among practical gardeners, there are still differing opinions about one of these methods. We will present them to you without sugarcoating. The story begins in the heart of the South American tropical forest belt, and that might sound far away at first. From the community gardens in Brandenburg, from the raised beds in the Allgäu, from the balcony boxes in Austrian cities, but the distance fades as soon as you understand what is actually at stake here. Anyone who sees the Amazon rainforest for the first time in old photographs or film footage instinctively thinks, the soil here must be inexhaustible, green everywhere, trees like cathedrals, leaves as big as tabletops, an abundance that takes your breath away. But appearances are deceiving. The rainforest carries its wealth above the ground, in the trees, the branches, the leaves. What falls to the ground, dead leaves, wood, dead animals, is decomposed by bacteria and fungi within a few days and immediately absorbed again by shallow roots. Beneath that lies loamy, acidic soil, thin, depleted, poor in everything vegetables need to grow. Anyone who plants fields there has next to nothing left after 2 to 3 years. Then move on, clear again, burn again. The cycle is mercilessly short. And yet, when a Spanish conquistador named Francisco de Orellana sailed down the Amazon in 1542, he found something that left his observers in genuine amazement. Densely populated cities, extensive fields, populations that his chroniclers estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands, on the very same soil that was normally exhausted and abandoned after 3 years of cultivation. How was this possible? The answer literally lay beneath these people's feet, but it took centuries for science to take it seriously. Beneath these ancient settlements, sometimes several meters deep, sometimes in layers spanning vast areas. A soil was found that differed significantly from everything around it. Dark, almost black, rich, alive, in some ways more humus than soil. The locals called it Terra Preta de Indio, the black earth of the Indians. A Dutch soil scientist named Wim Sombroek systematically described the soil for Western science for the first time in the 1960s, and what he saw never let him go. The microbial activity was many times higher than in untreated soils of the same region. The humus content was extraordinary. Phosphorus and potassium were present in plant-available forms, something never seen in the neighboring tropical soil. But then came the finding that raised the real question. This earth was spreading, slowly, without human intervention, as if it had a momentum of its own that transformed the exhausted soil and its surroundings, inch by inch, into its dark, living reflection. Year after year, decade after decade, without anyone helping it along. Carbon analysis provided the explanation. The carbon in this soil was 2,000 to 3,000 years old, and it did not decay. Normal humus, normal organic matter, breaks down, decomposes, and returns its carbon to the atmosphere. This did not. It was charcoal, purposefully produced under controlled conditions and systematically incorporated into the soil. The peoples of the ancient Amazon, their names are lost, their cities covered by jungle, their tools rusted and gone, had not simply composted waste. They had produced biochar and used it to build a soil architecture that still works today, 2,000 years later, just as it did on the first day. Science today calls this substance biochar. Now begins something that brings this story from the distant tropics very close to our own gardening reality. Because terra preta is not a phenomenon limited to the Amazon. Similar dark, deeply humus-rich soils appear in West Africa, in Denmark, in Slavic Central Europe, in the northeastern German lowlands. Archaeologists and soil scientists speak of anthropogenic dark earths, of soils that, through centuries of human activity, have developed a quality that clearly stands out from all naturally surrounding ones. Anyone digging at old settlement sites today, in the Spreewald, in the Uckermark, along old trade and pilgrimage routes, occasionally comes across such layers. No tropical climate, no rainforest, but the same principle via other paths, through other hands, over other centuries. In old monastery gardens of the Middle Ages, in those walled paradises of medicinal plants, vegetable beds, and fruit trees, tended with great care by Benedictines, Cistercians, and Franciscans, incorporating charred remains was standard practice. The charred remnants from the kitchen fires, the black soot from the potteries, the ashes from hearths. All of this went into the beds, not because the brothers had a theory, but because the observation passed from generation to generation was clear. Soil that had absorbed this black material yielded more. Darker soil brought better harvests. That wasn't a doctrine. It was lived, inherited experience. Imagine Gertrude, a woman in her 60s in the Brandenburg-Fleming region, sometime in the 1950s. Her husband had not returned from the war. She tended a small garden by the shed of her allotment association. She had been there for 30 years, knew every handful of dirt on her plot like the lines on her own hand. Her father had passed down a technique to her, which his mother had learned from her own mother. The charred remains from the stove after an autumn fire, after burning the bean poles in October. Never onto the street, never onto the dump, always under the potatoes, always between the beans, always in the spot where the tomatoes would go. Why? Gertrude couldn't have explained it. She only knew. The soil that received the black powder turned darker, and what grew in dark soil grew well. That was entirely enough for her. And then there was Werner, a retired forester from the Fichtel Mountains, who had spent his entire working life observing and understanding the forest. Werner noticed something that occupied his mind for years. Old charcoal kiln sites, the round, characteristically darkened patches in the forest floor left over from the charcoal burner settlements of the 19th and early 20th centuries, when the Fichtel Mountains were still crisscrossed by charcoal-burning families, regenerated faster and denser after a clear cut or a forest fire than the surrounding area. Not a little faster, noticeably faster. Werner started digging. He compared soil samples from old kiln sites with the neighboring untouched forest soil. He spoke with foresters in neighboring districts who had observed the same thing without being able to explain why. What Werner found matched point for point what soil scientists would prove 30 years later in controlled laboratory experiments. The charcoal that had entered the forest soil through years of charcoal burning had permanently changed it, not depleted it, but improved it. And somewhere in the Altmark, in a small community garden association in the 1960s, there was an old farmer's wife. Let's call her Elfriede. Her exact name is not recorded, who had the best tomatoes in the club year after year. When fellow club members asked what her secret was, she shrugged and tapped the soil of her bed with her finger. Darker than all the others, looser, somehow more alive to the touch. She dumped the remains of the autumn fire into it for 30 years, just like her mother before her. What she didn't know, she was acting on the exact same principle that soil scientists would painstakingly extract from old tropical soils 20 years later. That is the first and most important thing to know about biochar. It is not a new trend, not a manufactured product, not an invention of modern agricultural chemistry. It is ancient empirical knowledge gathered in countless small observations, passed down from hand to hand over generations, which the science of recent decades has translated into a precise, measurable picture. And this picture starts smaller than you might initially think, much smaller. Let's take a single grain of biochar, small enough that you can barely feel it between two fingertips, smaller than a grain of sand. Inside this grain is an internal surface area that, depending on the manufacturing temperature and source material, can range between 200 and 400 temperature. This is revealed by electron microscopy, and it sounds so absurd that it takes a moment to truly grasp. A speck of dust with the interior surface area of a large 5-room apartment. No metaphor, no poetic exaggeration. Measured, reproducible physics. Biochar is created through a process that science calls pyrolysis, from the Greek words for fire and separating. When organic material, wood straw, grain husks, nutshells, shrub clippings, plant residues, is heated to temperatures between 300 and 700 degrees without access to free oxygen, the volatile compounds escape as gases and vapors. What remains is the carbon skeleton of the original material, a three-dimensional network of tiny tunnels, chambers, and cavities. Porous as a sponge, but on a scale invisible to the naked eye, and stable as glass. Chemically almost completely inert. Normal humus breaks down, decomposes, and off-gases its carbon back into the atmosphere over decades. Biochar does not do this. It stays in the soil, just as terra preta has stayed for 2,000 years. This structure interests microbiologists and soil ecologists for one very specific reason. Soil microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, archaea, the invisible workforce that makes nutrients plant available in the first place, builds up humus, and breaks down pollutants, are looking for exactly such protected places. They are tiny, and their whole world consists of the microspaces between soil particles, and they need protection. A heavy downpour can wash an entire bacterial population out of sandy soil. Direct sunlight kills sensitive fungal networks. Drought decimates what moisture has built up. But in the micropores of biochar, these organisms find what they are looking for. Solid structures, moist and protected surfaces, stable cavities where stable communities can be established. They settle in, they multiply, they stay. The population density of microorganisms immediately surrounding a single grain of biochar can be orders of magnitude higher than in untreated soil just half a centimeter away. That is not a gradual difference. That is a different ecosystem right in the middle of the garden bed, invisible to the eye, but very real in its effects. And here lies the thought that changes the entire picture and is so fundamental that it deserves a moment to sink in. Biochar does not fertilize. It houses the community of organisms that nourishes the soil. That might sound like an academic distinction, but it is of enormous importance in gardening practice. Anyone who uses artificial fertilizer feeds the plant directly, quickly, measurably, immediately visibly, and then it's gone. Rainwater dissolves it. The plant absorbs what it can use. The rest seeps away or evaporates. The soil itself does not get any better from it. The microbial community, which should be the actual living backbone of any fertile soil, remains understaffed, unstable, vulnerable. Biochar does something fundamentally different. It offers this microbial community permanent, stable housing, and communities that are securely anchored in a substrate work more efficiently, more diversely, and more long-term than those that have to start over after every rain or dry spell. Mycorrhizal fungi, for example, fine, widely branching fungal networks that form a close symbiotic relationship with plant roots, spread through the pore network of the biochar and access minerals that roots alone could never have reached. They supply the plant with phosphorus from bound soil minerals in exchange for sugar that the plant releases. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria settle in neighboring cavities and convert atmospheric nitrogen into a form that plant roots can use directly, free of charge, without a bag, without a packet, without buying anything. This is also the actual explanation for why Terra preta spreads. The living microbial community, which has found stable structures in the biochar, slowly improves and transforms the soil in its immediate vicinity, year after year, without further human intervention. Researchers at the University of Hohenheim have been able to show in field trials on southern German soils over several growing seasons that biochar significantly increases the organic carbon content in the soil and significantly improves its water-holding capacity. Both are key indicators of long-term soil fertility, and both improvements did not decrease over the years of the trial, but rather increased because the microbial community grew and stabilized. The Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig has investigated, among other things, how biochar works on contaminated soils. On soils enriched with heavy metals like lead, cadmium, and zinc due to decades of industrial inputs, traffic emissions, or old house and artist paints. These ions can migrate from such soils into plant roots without the vegetables showing the slightest outward sign of it. They look healthy, they taste healthy, but the contamination is there. The internal surface area of biochar has a pronounced ability to bind and immobilize these metal ions so that they are no longer accessible to roots. This is not a complete purification process, and anyone with severely contaminated soil should seek expert advice. But it is a measurable, significant filtering mechanism. Anyone who runs their vegetable garden near a busy road, on an old property, or by a house from the Victorian era with old lead-based paints is doing something for their bed by incorporating biochar that goes far beyond mere nutrient supply. The Research Institute of Organic Agriculture, FIBL, in Switzerland, has tested biochar in organic farming systems over several years and came to consistent findings. The combination of charged biochar and compost improves both yields and measurable soil quality parameters, especially under drought-stress conditions, which have become more frequent in parts of Central Europe in recent years. Hot, dry summers, longer gaps between rainfall. Many of you know this from your own gardens, and the trend of recent years has put the topic of water-holding capacity back on the agenda. A comprehensive analysis of field trials in several European countries, which also involved research groups from Germany, showed that biochar, when applied correctly, increases yields by an average of 10 to 15%. The entire effectiveness hinges on this caveat when applied correctly, because there is one mistake that is made so often that it has given biochar an unjustifiably bad reputation among many. We will now explain this mistake in detail, but first, a brief moment on what you will observe in the garden bed, for everyone who likes to imagine how a change unfolds. Imagine, early in October, you have cleared the beds, the last bean poles are on the compost pile, the air smells of damp leaves and the first hint of autumn. Yesterday you incorporated the biochar, mixed with the mature autumn compost. The earth shimmers darkly in the pale afternoon light. The smell, earth with a slight undertone of wood smoke, earthier and fuller than usual. The bed looks different from the neighboring beds, deeper, darker, as if it were wetter, even though it hasn't rained. The biochar gives the soil a velvety matte coloration, reminiscent of the blackest of old humus. A month later, if you take a handful of this earth from the treated bed during this time and hold it to your nose, It smells different than in October, rounder, more alive, fuller. That is not your imagination. That is the smell of an active microbial community, of billions of small organisms that have moved into the cavities of the biochar and begun to build the nutrient system that makes this earth different from now on. In the spring, when the ground thaws, darker soil warms up faster than light, sandy areas. Sandy. In a treated bed, the soil temperature at a depth of 10 centimeters can rise above the germination threshold of most vegetable seeds several days earlier in the year. Earlier direct sowing, an earlier start to the season. Not a dramatic effect on any single day, but noticeable over an entire growing season. In the second year, when the first tomato seedlings are planted, the roots encounter a different substrate than in previous years. Loose, evenly moist, aerated. The biochar retains soil moisture, but it doesn't waterlog it. The water is available, not bound. During a dry July with long periods without significant rain, treated beds retain soil moisture noticeably longer than untreated areas next to them. Not indefinitely, but long enough that reaching for the watering can become less frequently necessary. Watering every other day instead of daily saves your knees and saves water. And at some point in the third or fourth year, something becomes visible that is hard to translate into numbers, but which every experienced gardener immediately recognizes. The earth breaks differently under the spade. It sticks less, crumbles evenly, lies loose and alive. Plant roots that you pull out when transplanting are more broadly branched, finer, deeper, with stronger stems, deeper green leaves, and the neighbors on the adjacent plot start asking what exactly you are doing over there. Now for the practical part, and first to the mistake that hits almost everyone on their first try and can ruin the entire result. Raw biochar, freshly made or freshly bought, worked directly into the garden soil. In the first few weeks, this can cause the exact opposite of what you hope for. The pores are empty, dry, and extraordinarily absorbent. So absorbent that fresh char sucks nitrogen and soil moisture from its surroundings instead of releasing them. Anyone who doesn't know this works in raw char, sees drooping leaves and stunted plants 4 weeks later, and draws the obvious but incorrect conclusion: this doesn't work. But it does work. Only a single step is missing. The char must be charged before it is incorporated. Charging sounds like a technical term, but it is a very simple process. There are two methods that have proven equally effective. The first method is the compost route. Add the biochar to finished, mature compost. A good rule of thumb is 1 part char to 3 or 4 parts compost, and let this mixture sit for 4 to 8 weeks. Stir occasionally if the opportunity arises, but it's not mandatory. During this time, microorganisms from the compost migrate into the pores of the char. Nutrients dissolved in the compost are absorbed and stored in the tiny chambers. After this resting phase, the char is alive. The cavities are populated, the nutrient depots are filled. This mixture can now be worked into the garden soil and has a supportive rather than a competing effect from day one. The second method is particularly suitable for anyone who makes nettle tea, comfrey tea, or compost tea anyway. The biochar is simply added to the container and allowed to soak in it for several weeks. It soaks up the dissolved nutrients and microorganisms like a sponge. No extra effort, no additional containers, no special materials. The liquid manure serves simultaneously as fertilizer and as a charging medium. Anyone who has tried this method once wonders why they didn't do it sooner. Regarding the amount, for an established garden bed of about 5 minerations, roughly 500 to 700 grams of biochar are sufficient for the first application, distributed evenly over the surface and worked into the top 20 to 25 centimeters. That sounds like a little. It actually is a little, but it is enough to set a process in motion that will reinforce itself over the coming years. You don't need to work deeper than 30 centimeters. The most biologically active soil zone is in the top 20 to 25 centimeters anyway, and that is exactly where biochar unfolds its greatest effect. If you have a raised bed or prefer working in a raised bed, which many of you do for very good reasons, because it saves your back and knees, because you can stand upright or sit on a low stool, because the soil warms up earlier and there is no bending over. You can use biochar particularly efficiently when setting it up or refreshing it. When filling, Mix 15 to 20% charged biochar into the substrate. This improves not only the biological activity, but also the water holding capacity. And this is especially important for raised beds, because raised beds dry out much faster in hot summers than ground level beds. The biochar noticeably slows down this drying process. Anyone who has taken this step once when setting up or refreshing will notice the difference by the second dry summer at the latest. For anyone who physically no longer wants or is able to do heavy digging fork work, and that is a perfectly reasonable stance that is taken explicitly seriously here, there is a gentle, targeted variant that still shows good results. When transplanting, when putting in seedlings, or when planting bulbs and garlic, simply take a heaping tablespoon of charged biochar and put it into the planting hole. Stir it in briefly, insert the plant, and you're done. A simple hand trowel is perfectly sufficient. No lifting, no bending, no prying. With this method, the effect is concentrated per plant rather than spread over the entire bed. But especially for tomatoes, bell peppers, zucchini, pumpkins, dahlias, or roses, this targeted approach is very well suited and often shows visible effects in the very first year. An important warning at this point, which we want to take seriously: fresh, still hot, or even just warm biochar must never be added directly to soil, compost, or organic material. For one thing, there is a fire hazard that should not be underestimated. For another, residual heat kills the sensitive microorganisms in the compost that are supposed to populate the char later. Always let it cool down completely on a stone slab, on a gravel path, or on the concrete pad in front of the garden shed. Depending on the weather, this can take an hour or significantly longer, and you simply have to allow for this time. Never on dry leaves, never on wooden pallets, never on the compost bin. Now for the production. For anyone who wants to do it themselves, the easiest way, which requires no special equipment, works with a standard metal bucket with a tight-fitting lid. Such buckets can be found at Obi, Bauhaus, or Hornbach for a few euros, and occasionally at flea markets for even less. You pack the bucket tightly with dry prunings, dry wood scraps, nutshells, or dry plant debris. The material must be truly dry. Fresh, moist material consumes all the pyrolysis energy in evaporating water and yields hardly any usable char. Close the lid tightly and place the bucket in the middle of a fire or a safe fire pit. The heat from the outside creates pyrolysis on the inside without the contents being able to burn completely because oxygen is lacking. After it has cooled down completely, truly completely, this is not a matter of patience but of safety, you open the bucket. What is inside should be black, light, and dry. Anything that still looks brown and woody goes back in for the next round. Those who cannot use an open fire pit, sometimes the garden rules in an allotment association actually do not allow it, and that is a legitimate point, can buy ready-made biochar. At agricultural wholesalers or organic gardening suppliers, it costs between 1 and 3 euros per kilogram, depending on quality and quantity. For an initial incorporation in a medium-sized allotment garden, you need 20 to 30 kilos. That comes to a one-time total of 30 to 90 euros. Regarding the question that is still debated among practical gardeners, does biochar need to be added every year, or is a one-time incorporation permanently sufficient? One side says, once incorporated, it remains permanently in the soil. Further additions bring hardly any measurable added value after the first year. The other side says, small annual amounts as part of the normal compost application prolong the effect and replenish areas that have been mixed up by transplanting or harvesting. Both positions have their merits, and neither one nor the other can be claimed as the only correct one at the current state of research. What is certain, the greatest effect occurs during the initial incorporation in depleted or severely disturbed soils. Those who already have a living, humus-rich soil will see less improvement. A reasonable approach is therefore, invest a decent amount during the initial incorporation, observe and compare for the next 2 years, and then decide whether small annual additions seem sensible. To conclude this section, a little calculation for anyone keeping a watchful eye on the household budget, which is very sensible in retirement. A standard slow-release fertilizer for a medium-sized allotment garden costs between 20 and 50 euros per season and must be bought anew every spring. 30 years of gardening at an average of €30 annually. That adds up to €900 just for fertilizer. A one-time initial incorporation of 20 to 30 kilos of charged biochar costs between 30 and €90 if you buy it. If you make it yourself from your own dry prunings, it costs next to nothing besides your own time. On a retiree's budget, the difference is not just a theoretical number, it is tangible and noticeable. There are things in the garden that you do once and that then continue to work on their own, long after your last effort. Planting a hedge that offers protection to birds for 30 years. A row of fruit trees planted with patience and a long-term vision that carries far beyond one's own time in the garden. Incorporating biochar belongs in this category, not as a measure for more yield this season, but as an investment in a soil that lives and works beyond your own gardening time, and which might be dug up by someone in 20 years who wonders why this earth is so dark and alive. The peoples who created Terra Preta have disappeared. Their languages have been lost, their cities overgrown, their tools rusted, and yet they left behind something that anyone who takes a spade and digs can still measure today. 2,000 years. The earth that they worked into the ground with soot-blackened hands has remained. That is a quiet, unspectacular form of permanence. Quieter than any monument and more enduring than any stone. It is not the monumental that has survived. The organic, the modest, what was worked into the earth has remained. Anyone who puts a handful of charged biochar into a planting hole this coming spring is doing something that Gertrude from the Fleming region of Brandenburg, Werner from the Fichtel Mountains, and Elfriede from the Altmark region did out of the same simple instinct. What the monks in their medieval kitchen gardens practiced without theory, but with a watchful eye. What was passed down from hand to hand in these gardens as silent knowledge through post-war years and allotment associations with their Sunday morning gatherings, and what is measured today in field trials and described in technical reports. The knowledge was always there. The language for it is new. Gardening is not a project for a single season. It is a slow, patient conversation with an earth that changes, and changes best when we give it something that lasts. If you want to try just one thing this year, let it be this. Place a small metal bucket with dry prunings into the next autumn fire, or buy a manageable amount of biochar and put it in the compost for a month. Then wait, observe, and in 2 years, compare the treated bed with the adjacent ones. What you find then will tell you more than any second-hand explanation. If this story about the hidden power of the Black Earth has changed your perspective on your own garden, then subscribe to this channel and give us a like. We are digging up the knowledge here that time had almost forgotten in order to plant a fertile future together. The next secret of nature is already waiting to be discovered by you.